Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Book Interview, a show where we get authors and interview them about their books. It's pretty self-explanatory. This week, we have debut author Adesua Agboila, who's here to talk to us about her book, This Poisonous Arrow. Could you just share a little bit about how you even got the idea for the novel?
I really came to this novel because I was so interested in one really specific question, which was, if my ancestors could come to me, what would they say? And I just couldn't stop thinking about that question, so I wrote an entire novel about it, which is essentially about a first-generation Nigerian-American woman named Isoken, who, after her mother unexpectedly passes away, begins being haunted by the ghost of her ancestor, who is named Ie. You know, I set out to write this book that's about an ancestor coming back and talking to a family member that lives in the present day, but then I realized I was also writing a book about the struggles that first generation immigrants face with forming an identity in a land that is not their own, right? And how hard it can be to form an identity in a world where people are constantly forcing their ideas of what you should be onto you. And so something I realized really quickly is that the idea of ancestry is just so tied up in the idea of identity. It's impossible, right, to talk about one without talking about the other, because I think we are who we are in part because we came from people who came before us. And I think for a lot of first generation immigrants, at least for me, because we're so divorced from our ancestors and our ancestry, we often lose some parts of our identity, and we start looking for ways to construct our identity that makes sense to us. So this book is also very much about how the first generation immigrant experience is and how, those people construct themselves, especially in the American context, and what are the things that those people turn to help them construct their identities. And I think that those are all questions that Isoken is asking herself constantly throughout the novel.
So how do your characters construct themselves?
Yeah, I think that is a question that the main character Isoken is asking herself over and over, right? Even before Ie comes into the picture, Isoken is constantly thinking about how to construct herself. She's always asking, how can my body exist in the world? What makes me me, right? And I think that Isoken is really attuned to the ways in which her body is being constructed by the people around her. The eyes around her, and really specifically by the eyes of men and of white men. And she's always thinking about how she can fit into the mold that they're creating for her, which is not a super healthy thing to always be thinking about.
This is something I was really interested in, the way that Isoken processes the gaze and how the gaze constructs her, because, right at the beginning of the novel, one of the first things that we learn about Isoken is that she is plagued by this ailment that she calls the headache. And it's something that she seems to carry around all the time. It almost seems like a physical creature or like a pet that wanders around with her. And that ailment seems really connected to the gaze.
Yes, exactly. So the headache is a big character in this book. And it's like a literal migraine, but it's also, Isoken lists all her symptoms in the book, but it's nausea and aching and chills, and it's really just pain, right? It's pain that she is constantly having to carry around in her body. And to me, when I was writing about the headache and thinking about the headache, it was sort of my way of, creating a physical manifestation of the way that Isuken perceives the gaze on her. And it gets worse and worse the more that people construct her as something to be disregarded. And I think that, so often Black people and Black women in particular are flattened by the white male gaze. And, this is something that like Fanon talks about in Black Skin, White Mass, which is a book that I love. But he talks about, the way that the gaze can just make you into this like two-dimensional caricature. And I think when people in Isuken's life look at her in a way that flattens her, that's when, the headache gets the worst. And that's when she feels the most pain, both emotionally but also physically.
And there's this moment really early on in the book where the headache gets so bad that it becomes this physical sensation that Isuken calls real, not real. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
That to me is sort of the extreme of like letting yourself be constructed by the gaze. Isuken describes real, not real as this feeling of being forced outside of her body. And it's really like dissociation, right? She can't identify with her body anymore. And it's because the people around her have made her into this person that she can't recognize. And it's funny, in the book, the moment that she enters real, not real for the first time is when she's on a plane back from Nigeria after burying her mom. And there's a man sitting next to her who reaches over her and like opens the plane window. And Isuken says that he just does it like she doesn't exist, like she's nothing. And it's such a small moment, right? But it's so significant to her. It's like her breaking point.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because, that scene is in chapter 3. And it's at the end of that chapter that we get the very first whispers of Ie, this ancient ancestor that comes along. And then it's almost...
I'm sorry. Did you always have those earrings?
Yes.
It's so interesting. They're exactly like mine.
I actually brought a clip from the novel from chapter 4 where Isuken meets Ie for the very first time, or at the very least sees Ie for the first time. And I think it would be perfect to play it right now because I think it's a real illustration of what you're talking about, right? This idea that our ancestors are always a part of us and that we just have to pull them out of ourselves to see them for ourselves. Let's roll that clip right now.
The only time Isuken had met another person who took mirrors more seriously than she did was at 15, when she had gone back to Lagos with her mother for a wedding. At the time, the headache was particularly oppressive. Isuken had been carrying around a migraine for a month, and some mornings she would wake up, and Real Not Real would be right there within her, and she would have to rush to her mother to force her way back into her body before it was too late. In Lagos, Isuken's mother made her go to the witch doctor. The woman had put her hand, cold and wet, on Isuken's forehead and then asked her mother something in Edo. Her mother had leaned in towards Isuken and whispered, "What do you know about mirrors?" "I don't know," Isuken said. "What does that even mean?" The witch doctor had said a pile of other things to her mother, and her mother said a pile of things back, and both of them gestured violently at each other until her mother kissed her teeth and they started to leave. But as Isuken was walking out, the witch doctor grabbed her hand and said something very urgently that Isuken could not understand. In the car, Isuken asked what the woman had said, and her mother had replied with a hint of trepidation. "She said you should make sure to have a lot of mirrors in your life." Isuken had not listened to the witch doctor. She did not have a lot of mirrors in her life, just the one hanging on her bedroom wall. But that was enough. And here, in the mirror, were her eyes, eyebrows, jawline, lips. And here, behind all of that, was a shadow made up of worms and light and curve and weight, and it was making itself into a person. What Isuken knew about mirrors was their ability to deliver relief. to give an unnamed thing shape and form, to be a sheet of ritual that Isuken could use to usher all the outshoots of her body into the world. And here was the ritual. This shadow was making itself into a person. Here was its shoulders, rounded and full, the kind that Isuken knew would dimple when moved. Here was its hair, stubby and black and coiled against scalp. Here was its skin, darker than Isuken's, ripped, close to black. Here was its face. A woman. Here was her face, round and soft, with everything a face needed, 2 eyes and 2 ears and 1 nose and a mouth with lips that hung slightly apart. Here was a shadow person, a whole woman right here, sitting beside her. The woman in the mirror put her head in the crook of Isuken's shoulder, her chin against Isuken's collarbone, her cheek against Isuken's cheek. In the mirror, here were the ways that their bodies moved into one line, sweet curves like mathematical equations graphed onto paper, smooth, continuous. She smelled like Mary's fried yam in ancient wood. Isuken kept staring into the mirror. If she looked away, out into the world, the woman might not be there at all, and Isuken would never get to name her and know her, and it was imperative that the woman was named and known, so that then she would become real in the way that all other things in Isuken's life were also real. The woman understood what needed to happen without Isuken having to say a word. She reached her fingers to Isuken's mouth to help the girl speak. "Ie," Isuken whispered. And this word, at least, was in her minuscule Edo vocabulary. Mother.
Where did you get that footage? Just, like, were those my hands? Because, like, I don't remember making that. Or
something I just wanted to point out is, I think it's really beautiful that the place where Isuken discovers Ie is in a mirror.
Yeah, I really love the image of a mirror, and mirrors are all over the book, especially when talking about the relationship between Isuken and Ie, because something else I'm really interested in is the concept of ancestral layering. Like, I sort of alluded to this before, but I think that our ancestors aren't just dead people who exist outside of us in a separate time that we can never access, right? Like, I think that they exist within us. I think they sit on top of us. I think they're a part of us.
I would love to dwell on this idea of ancestral layering a little longer, because something that starts to happen as Ie materializes in the novel is that she also starts possessing Isuken at certain points, which feels less like your ancestors being a part of you and more like your ancestors taking you over. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, well, I think that in this book in particular, the concept of ancestral layering is a concept with a lot of tension, right? Because to go back to this idea of like being constructed by the gaze, I think Isuken is always trying to shape herself into someone who can be understood by the white male gaze, right? But the question is, like, if you construct yourself into that person, like, is there space for your ancestor to reside? Like, if Isuken tries to make herself into a person who, like, lives up to her boss's standards, or, lives up to her love interest Nadir's standards, like, is there room for Ie to be part of that body?
It sounds to me like the main question of your book really is, how do you work with your ancestors to fashion yourself in a world that is built for neither you nor your ancestors? And what are the complications of that?
Yeah, that's crazy. That's like exactly right. It's almost like you read my journal or something before you came here. I would say, the entire novel, you're really wondering, like, will Isuken be able to find a way to construct herself? Will Isuken be able to find a way to live in harmony with her ancestor Ie? are we able to construct selves that honor our ancestors, but also remain true to ourselves?
I know that that's a question that you think about all the time.
Yeah, no, I mean, wait, I'm sorry. How do you know that?
I am you, right? I mean, well, I'm a version of you from the past.
Right, I mean, I guess you could say that I am your ancestor.
Haven't you noticed that we've never appeared in the same frame together?
Okay, yeah, no, okay, I guess, like,
Isn't this just like what you were talking about? I am your ancestor. And so, I exist inside of you.
You're not me, right? Because, like, you come from a different time than I do. You're different than me. Right?
I guess that's the question.